Well, thanks very much, Matt, and congratulations to you and the Institute for Liberal Studies for putting on this event. It's important work. You know, I have to confess that I fear Monday evenings. That's when my BlackBerry reminds me that I must put out the garbage and the recycling, and in doing so, abide by the City of Calgary's myriad rules around recycling and the disposal of garbage. The rules are set out in the bylaw regarding waste disposal, 22 pages of beautiful flowing prose, a real page turner. But the final arbiters of those rules aren't elected officials. The people who ultimately decide if the rules are being followed are the men and women who wear the crisp blue City of Calgary Sanitation Department overalls with their standard issue City of Calgary clipboards. They decide if our garbage and recycling habits meet the standards. They are judge, jury, and executioner. They are our garbage collection overlords. And if we want our garbage hauled away, we should bow down and pay them homage. On more than a few occasions, I've not met their criteria, and thus they refuse to take away my refuse or to recycle my recycling. For instance, if my garbage and recycling bins are not the right distance from the fence on our property line, or are not far enough out from the garage, they won't get picked up. Nor will they pick them up if they are too far out from the garage. They will not pick them up if the lid is open, even a hair. They will not pick them up if they are too heavy. They will not pick them up if certain kinds of garbage inside is bagged incorrectly. They will not pick them up if you have the wrong kind of garbage or if the recycling is sorted incorrectly. For instance, if a piece of drywall finds its way into the garbage, they will not pick up your garbage. They will give you a trash talking to. You may also be fined. They have a rule that says you are not allowed to put a refrigerator in your garbage bin, setting aside the fact that would be physically impossible. The city website helpfully reminds us that our garbage bins should not contain either radioactive materials or ammunition, as if an Albertan is going to throw away ammunition. The rules around recycling are so achingly complex it hurts to think about. I recently learned that plastic lids that bear a recycling symbol and that are bigger than a business card are supposed to go into the blue bin, but anything smaller goes into the garbage bin. Tin foil can be recycled, but if it's not clean enough, it goes in the garbage. Of course, you can always fashion it into a hat and go join the other people who made the rules in the first place. I live in constant fear of a recycling bin audit. God knows that at any one time, I'm almost certainly out of compliance. For instance, you are supposed to recycle plastic wrap, but you are forbidden from recycling food container packaging. But what if the food container packaging is plastic wrap, like the kind you find on a package of hamburger? What do we do then? Do we take the plastic wrap off, give it a careful scrubbing in the sink, and then recycle it? I'm afraid to call the city and ask them in case I out myself, and they set up surveillance on my recycling bin. Anyway, the rules run from incredibly detailed and complicated to vague and unintelligible, and the only people who would devote the time to learn about them are people I don't really want to meet. You know, this is only partly a tongue-in-cheek complaint. I pay significant money through my taxes for garbage and recycling pickup, but that's not the only cost. Over the course of a year, my family and I spent many hours rinsing out soup cans and breaking down cardboard boxes so as not to incur the wrath of the people who hold our garbage destiny in their hands. This puts the lie to the idea that municipal governments don't have power. To the contrary, we all dance to the tune of Mayor Nenshi and City Council, who have figured out how to get over 1 million Calgarians to spend hundreds of thousands of person hours per year rinsing out soup cans or cleaning our tin foil, which in turn probably puts us offside with the water use ordinance, but that's a subject for another day. The regulatory burden associated with owning a home in Calgary is not, per se, a regulatory taking. It does not impose burdens on my property to the point that it severely impedes the use of my property or damages the value of the property, at least not in a relative sense, because all homeowners must deal with the same regime. However, there's no question that all of these regulatory obligations associated with living in Calgary interfere with my right to use and enjoy my property. The question we always face is, are these interferences worth it? They certainly cost me money and time that could be deployed elsewhere according to my priorities. Add on all the other rules, and there is a substantial regulatory burden associated with home ownership in Calgary. This is why we need a city council whose members understand that property owners cannot be treated as though they are employees. It costs city council nothing to impose more rules on us, but the cost to those who must abide by the rules is heavy. We also have to abide by other sets of rules, taxes, and fees imposed by other levels of government. And together they do amount to a taking, even if regulatory taking is a concept barely recognized in Canadian law. And yet this cumulative impact of regulatory obligations gets short shrift from politicians, although it cannot be denied that they impede our ability to use and enjoy our property. Meanwhile, bureaucrats actually have an incentive to grow the regulatory burden. As public choice theory recognizes, more regulations mean a bigger staff for the a bigger staff to interpret and enforce those regulations, and more money for the managers who oversee them. Meanwhile, homeowners and small business people increasingly become victims of the tyranny of the petty bureaucrat. Note that I'm not even calling into question whether it's worthwhile to recycle some of these materials, which absolutely should be questioned. I've not raised the issue of private collection services, though that is undoubtedly a way to save money for Calgarians. Let's set all of that aside and assume that nothing changes. The question then is, how do we resolve this? For starters, we need to do a better job of defining the role of municipal governments. In an excellent paper from last year, David Seymour, who we just heard about, then of the Manning Foundation, noted that there are few rules that set out the responsibilities of municipalities in Alberta, with the exception of placing some limits around the authority to tax. There needs to be similar restrictions on what and how much they regulate, which could be accomplished by ensuring the Alberta provincial government modernizes its own very narrow laws around the protection of private property. Unfortunately, there's not a province in Canada that provides a legal protection to property owners who lose value in their property because of excessive regulation, but there should be. As the federal government contemplates what to do with the species at risk legislation, it's worth considering how different their approach would be if landowners had to be compensated for the regulatory taking implicit in such a law. Clearly then, we must also educate lawmakers, the media, and the public about the relatively weak protections for private property in Canada, which is a bit shocking actually, given that the ability to hold and use private property is at the root of Canadian prosperity. Even more fundamentally, the advancement and protection of private property is one of the most important factors in the rise and triumph of Western civilization. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a fact that cannot be repeated often enough. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, so I'm Peter McCaffrey from the Manning Foundation. I'm sorry to say, Monte, I think myself and our team at the Manning Foundation probably are exactly the type of people who would go through all of those very detailed recycling regulations and learn all of them. For example, most recently we did a report on council workload, and we looked at the exact number of pages that all the councillors were required to read in all of their committee meetings, and we produced a report on those reports, and our report was received pretty well by the council. In fact, they received that report so well they've now commissioned their own report to see whether they agree with our report, and they will be reporting on how many reports they ask their administration to report on, and you can expect that report soon, I'm sure. We will also be looking at the Municipal Governance Act and also at secondary suites as well, and some upcoming work. But today I want to talk about the sharing economy. It's a different type of property rights maybe that we don't often hear about these kind of conferences, but have certainly been in the media a lot recently. So First off, I don't want to spend too long on this because we talked a lot about this morning. What's property? Is it self-ownership? Is it mixing labour? Is it the ability to sell the property? Personally, I'd argue if you're not allowed to sell or rent out your property, you probably don't own it. So if you're not allowed to sell something. The sharing economy, the term originally was a bit different to maybe how it's been used now. You can see here it's championed, the concept's championed by people in books recently. It's described as to create value out of a shared and open resource in ways that balance personal self-interest with the good of a larger community. Of course, that's nonsense. That's not what it is. The sharing economy is property rights, voluntary transactions, and few or no government regulations. Key comes down to trust. So small communities used to have a lot more trust. You could trust your neighbour to lend them your lawnmower or to do all these sorts of things. Once you get to larger cities, you maybe don't know your neighbours so well, you don't know the community as well. It's too large of a place to have these kind of traditional trust mechanisms. But through technology, websites, reviews and things like that, where you can review a seller on eBay or something like that, we're now able to regain some of that trust. It's also about efficiency. If you buy a car and it sits on your driveway for 12 hours a day, or you drive it to work for half an hour and then it sits at work for 8 hours and then you drive it home, that's very inefficient. And Coe's theorem got a bit of a mention this morning as well. The key to more efficient resource allocation is lowering the transaction costs. The problem, of course, is that transaction costs for this kind of economy have been very high up until recently. Moral hazard, unease, lack of trust, the difficulty of finding someone to buy what you're selling. The internet predominantly has made that a lot easier. But before the internet, obviously that was a lot harder. So a lot of people have been buying outright. So it might be inefficient to buy a car, but you kind of had to do it because there's no alternative. And we'll get into things like Car2Go and stuff later. But the internet has really started to eliminate or significantly reduce a lot of those transaction costs. So first up, Uber. I'm going to run through very quickly a few of the examples of what the sharing economy might be. There's some very well-known names, there's some not so well-known names, there's some you've probably never heard of and probably never would have expected to exist. And then we'll go into a few more details about some of them. So Uber is obviously a ride-sharing system. You use your phone, use an app, and you request a ride from one place to the other, and someone comes and picks you up and takes you there. Again, I'll go into more detail on that soon. Lyft, very similar, but a little bit of difference around how, who and how the cars are owned. So Uber has a range of products. Lyft focuses purely on the driver owns the car and it's their own personal vehicle and they use it in their spare time to give you a lift. This is a quote from John Zimmer of Lyft talking about regulatory challenges they've had to deal with councils. Obviously you can imagine some of this stuff has been very controversial, that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more. But they interpret laws one way and are trying to do their job. We interpret laws another way and try to innovate. If we took the approach of waiting to see what the government does to create a path that's very clear, we wouldn't be in business anyway. Sidecar, again, similar. Airbnb is renting out your house. Now that could be when you're there and you rent out a spare room, or it could be when you're away for a holiday. Or some people now are starting to buy rental properties and renting them out a couple of weeks at a time rather than months or years at a time. Spin lister, you can hire a bike from a friend. So if your friend is away for a week, you can go and hire their bike while they're away or something like that. TaskRabbit's a fun one. This one you can basically go on the website and say, I need a job done. Any kind of job. It could be going to post your letters, could be writing Christmas cards, could be, I think this person is getting someone to help them move house, looks like in the picture. Basically any task, and then someone can reply to your advert and say, yeah, I can do that, here's a price. Or the other way around, they can say, I'm good at this. You go on the site and see what it's going to cost you. Lending Club, here you go on and say, I would like to get a loan for XYZ, to start my business or to buy a car or whatever. And individuals can go on the site, look at your proposal and offer to lend you money if they want. Basically the same way a bank does, but they get to decide whether they think your idea is worth it or not. This one's a little bit different. This one is a Wi-Fi sharing system, where if you sign up and you commit to allowing your Wi-Fi network to be open to anyone else that's a member of this, then if you find anyone else who's a member of this, who has their system open, then you can access their Wi-Fi as well. You can see they've got 13 million. You could argue this is probably dropping off a little bit more now that data costs on cell phones have come down a lot, but this was very popular a few years ago for traveling and things like that. This is a fun one, Eat With. This is kind of like Airbnb, but instead of the person sleeping in your house, they come and have a meal. So you can cook them dinner, and they'll come along and pay you for dinner, and you have dinner with them, or you can cook them and they can eat. Apparently very popular with chefs who, when they're working during the day, are very restricted on the kind of menus they have to deal with at work. They're very limited on the kind of things that they do, and a lot of chefs love to go home and practice new dishes and come up with ideas and invite people to come along and have meals with them. Canary, this one's fun. This is basically Uber for buying cannabis. They only operate in the states where it's legal in the US, so there's no issues around that. But that's another one. You basically, on your phone, you can order it and they'll go and pick it up for you. Dog vacay. This is great. If you're going away for a holiday, instead of sending your dog to the, the official pound or whatever it is where you leave them for a week, you can just leave them with someone on this website and pay for them to look after your dog for a week. Now, I've got a couple here that is maybe a bit more marginal as to whether this is a property right. Maybe we can discuss this in the questions a little bit more. StubHub here is if you buy tickets, or you're a season ticket holder and you can miss one of the games, something like that, you can on-sell your tickets. There's some interesting debate that could go into this, in that a lot of these companies that initially sell the tickets put in the terms and conditions that you can't on-sell the tickets. So if you want to get into libertarian theory, should they be allowed to put those conditions in there, and if they do, should you be allowed to on-sell them against the terms and conditions? Do you really own the tickets, or have you bought a license to use that seat for that particular event only in your name? And this is another very interesting one. This company called Monkey Parking, they operate in San Francisco. And when I first heard about these guys, I assumed it was if you have a spare parking spot outside your house in San Francisco, you can go on the site and list your house and allow someone to purchase your parking spot for a few hours or whatever. But it doesn't actually work that way. The way Monkey Parking works is if you're parked in a public parking spot and you're about to leave, you can put on the app that you're about to leave that parking spot, and then someone who's driving around the city looking for a parking spot can pay you to wait until they get there, and then they can have a spot. Now, I would argue that this is caused by the fact that San Francisco doesn't charge enough for parking, so therefore have a limited supply. But the city, of course, said that no, you can't do that. It's a public parking spot. You can't sell the parking spot. Monkey Parking's response was, we're not selling the parking spot, we're selling the information about when I'm leaving. So I have the right to tell people if I'm about to leave a parking spot, and they have the right to pay me for such information. I'm not selling a parking spot, I'm just telling them when I'm going to move my car. So go into a little bit more detail about Uber, just because it's the most common, most well-known one, and it's easy to have a good sort of more in-depth discussion when people have an idea about more precisely how this works. So the top one here is a quote from Travis Kalanick, who's the Uber president. He says, "Stand by your principles and be comfortable with confrontation. So few people are, so when the people with the red tape come, it becomes a negotiation. So don't let them tell you around." He could have just said the second quote, which is from someone else famous. It's essentially the same thing. The question isn't who's going to let me, it's who's going to stop me. I'll let you look up who that was if you want. This is from Today, Town Hall magazine, preview of the next issue of their magazine. It's called Uber Republicans. And a quote from this, oh no, I haven't got the quote. It's essentially, okay, I'll move on. Washington Post, very similar article. Will the sharing economy make us all Republicans? I don't want to get into the politics of it all, but this is the kind of stuff that's going on in the media at the moment. The quote from this is that Republicans understandably salivate at the sight of liberals for once railing against government overreach, excessive licensing requirements, taxes and safety regulations, threatening a service they love. Is it too much of a stretch to hope that these rideshare fans might rise up to oppose similar government-imposed obstacles facing plenty of other American businesses, power utilities, financial companies, industrial manufacturers, and other companies like Uber? The article went on to conclude that yes, it is. There's no way they're going to apply the same standards to all sorts of other businesses. But I think there's definitely some potential here, particularly for younger people who are getting used to this idea that, hey, we don't actually need a government to regulate the safety. I can tell whether an Uber ride is going to be safe based on the fact that the guy's got 300 five-star ratings from people that got a ride from him earlier, and he's also cheaper than getting a taxi. So these are some of the things that Uber offers. Uber X, this is the very low end of the scale. This is where the driver owns the car and is basically doing it part-time themselves. They'll come and pick you up. There's a few regulations around the car has to be a certain age. It can't be a very old car, and they have to have insurance that covers them and things like that. But essentially it's a private car owned by someone, and it's probably not going to look like that. It's probably going to look like a regular car. Then there's Uber Taxi, which is interesting. This only works in some cities where city regulations permit it, and again, this is where we get into council regulations and local government. But this allows taxi drivers to get a copy of the app on their phone, and then instead of driving around the city to pick up rides, they can actually receive ride requests from the app as well. So they can do both at the same time. Taxi companies don't really like it, as you can imagine, because the taxi company doesn't get a cut if the guy's out doing an Uber ride rather than a taxi ride. Uber Black is the traditional Uber where you basically have a private driver. It's a private car that's used basically just for this purpose. SUV and luxury, which are the same, just different kinds of vehicles. But this is where it starts to get fun. This is where you start to see the kind of innovation that you don't get in the traditional taxi monopoly system. This is Uber Corner Store. And this is a new service that they've introduced in a few cities where you can order an Uber, but you can add on to your order that you don't actually want them to take you anywhere, you want them to bring you stuff. And they have a menu of items, and the driver of the Uber car will go to the grocery store and buy the items for you at fixed prices, bring you their car around to your place, give you the goods and leave. And then of course it all goes straight onto your credit card. So it's basically a delivery service for groceries. You can get the same for your lunch. They can deliver fast food from any restaurant that doesn't do their own delivery service. And again, you can think about the economies of scale of having a company like this do deliveries for businesses rather than individual Chinese and Vietnamese restaurants having to run their own delivery services. And then there's Uber Rush, which is essentially a courier service for businesses which uses Uber cars to deliver important documents from one place to another. Again, only available in a few cities because most cities consider all these things illegal. This, I think, is one of the most fascinating. This is Uber Pool. This is a new thing that they're starting in San Francisco. Again, these guys tend to launch things in San Francisco, New York, and roll them out over time. But Uber Pool is essentially like you get the van at the airport and you share a ride with 4 or 5 other people and you go to each spot and they drop you off an order and they have some kind of system in the head office that calculates exactly the route they should take to save the most time to drop you all off. The difference, of course, being that you have to wait at the airport for half an hour for them to fill up the van. Uber Pool does that, but you can have multiple pickup and drop-off locations. So you don't have to all be at the airport or all going to the airport. So you just put in where you want to go from, where you want to go to, and if you check the option that says I don't mind sharing the ride, you pay 40% of what you would usually pay for the ride. So with this, they're starting to get to the point now where you can get a ride to somewhere for cheaper than public transport. Not just cheaper than taxi, but cheaper than public transport. And of course, Uber has all the tech in the back end to be able to work out the routes with the multiple points of starting and finishing. This is where it's going to get really interesting because this is where Uber is going to start to hurt. So what about when you don't need a driver? When your car itself can drive you around? Then you don't even need a fleet of vehicles as Ubers because then everyone can use their own car. Imagine driving to work in your car for half an hour in the morning. You leave your car at work, go up to your office, and then for the 8 hours during the office, you turn on the system where someone is allowed to rent your car, and then it self-drives to go and pick them up and drop them off wherever they are for the 8 hours while you're at work, and then you set the time that you're ready to leave work, and the car makes sure it's back there in time to take you home. So now you've got 8 hours worth of income from your car while it's sitting around at home. And again, this gets back into those efficiencies. Again, no way this is happening in any of the Canadian cities at the moment because it's all illegal. California started legalizing self-driving cars, and I think a couple of other states, but obviously not for this purpose. There's a very big difference between them saying you can have a self-driving car for test purposes and for making money. So that's the end of the sort of the slides of the different options we have, and then if we go into the sort of the policy of it. So most recently, Calgary has been discussing taxi plates. Now, this is a tricky one because essentially you've got a property right, or what they call a property right, that has been given to existing taxi drivers, where you're allowed a license plate to be a taxi driver. And because of the hugely restricted supply on taxis, those plates are often worth a whole pile of money. So in Calgary, they're worth a couple of $100,000. In Toronto, they're worth about $600,000. In New York, they're worth more than $1 million. That's simply because the city doesn't release enough plates to meet the demand for the number of people who want to drive taxis. And we've got to the point where the price of the plate is determined not by the income that the taxi is generating, but just purely the capital gains on the plate itself, based on speculation that the prices will keep going up. Personally, I wouldn't be going anywhere near buying investments in taxi plates, given what I've just shown you with Uber and things like that, but apparently a lot of people still are. And so just a couple of weeks ago, there was a big debate at council in Calgary, and a couple of hundred taxi drivers turned up for a debate on whether the city should increase the number of taxi plates that are available. And you walk around the meeting and you talk to people, and it was almost to every single person, the odd exception, but almost exactly, anyone who owned a taxi plate already was opposed to the idea of adding more taxi plates. Anyone who didn't own a taxi plate wanted as many as possible so they had a chance of getting them. The last time Calgary increased the number of taxi plates they had, they increased it by 61, I believe, last year, and they had more than 2,000 applications to have one of those plates. And that's despite the fact, actually, they've recently changed the rules so that any new taxi plates can't be on-sold. So all the old taxi plates still have these ridiculous inflated values, but all the new plates can't be on-sold. So there's still a huge demand for more plates, even despite the fact that you can't get them for capital gains anymore. They're talking about adding a couple of hundred on this time, and in my opinion, that's still crazy because, as you'll see from this. So back to Travis's comment here. If this will work. It's freezing on me. Here we go. So one of the interesting things about some of these companies is that they're not afraid to take on the regulations and just go and do things. So most recently we saw Uber launch a couple of their products in Ottawa. And they had a couple of free days while they trialed out the system, and anyone could get a ride for free. And they announced from the Monday on they'd be charging. And come Monday, the planning and the transit and the safety departments in Ottawa basically ran sting operations on Uber. And they had officials in the council departments order Uber rides, get in, get charged for the ride, and then hand out fines to the people who were offering the rides. In other cities, it's gone to the point where people have been arrested for providing rides. Uber's response was to say, okay, that's fine, we'll make the rides free again indefinitely. So their response to the government regulation was to say, fine, we'll give free rides. And their tactic up until now, they're worth about $18 billion based on their latest investment round they raised. Their tactic at the moment is basically just to get as many people as fans of Uber and this kind of service, so that when governments try and regulate them out, there's a huge outpouring of annoyance by the public who've come to actually like having a taxi service where it turns up quickly and it's reasonably priced and they get where they're going without any huge delays like you have with the existing taxi system. I think in DC is probably the most successful example of a campaign where a particular councillor proposed laws for DC that were explicitly called Uber alterations to laws. That was the title of the bill they proposed. And it was basically going to set minimum prices to say, you know, the minimum, it was basically to classify them as a limo service and say the minimum price you're allowed to charge for a ride in an Uber versus, you know, $60, $70 or something like that, which would basically entirely cut them out of the market. Uber basically just emailed all of their customers in the DC, Virginia, Maryland area, encouraged them all to contact the councillor. The councillor received 50,000 emails from supporters over the course of a week. And a month later, she introduced legislation to legalize Uber and voted for it. So that's some of the strategies these guys have been taking. I had a video I was going to play to close. I don't think this. We haven't got any speakers connected to this video to this laptop, so I'm not sure it's going to work. We can give it a try, but maybe it might be easier if people are interested in the video just to come up and have a look at it afterwards. But I think I managed to find the one South Park clip in the world that could possibly be played at a public location. And it was actually from last night's episode, which was all about the sharing economy and about ride shares and things like that. It's a fantastic clip. So I encourage you to come up after the questions and have a look at that. But for now, we'll leave it there. Thank you.